Hello again and very welcome to the chapter Attacking Methods 2. Here I would like to continue the investigation about important methods within attacking play. There are three things that I would like to look at here. First, how we can exploit weak spots in the opponent's camp. Secondly, the role of sacrifices within the attacker's play. And finally, something about, you could say, restriction, prophylaxis and provocation, in the sense that we are looking at what our opponent would like to do and we can take appropriate measures, or we can even force them into some action that they would not like to do. So let's get started. Our first example, it's about how we can exploit weak spots in the opponent's camp. And I think it's a simple example, but I like it very much because it's rather instructive. With white pieces, Pragananda, and playing black is Gagare. You recognize, of course, this pawn structure from the Italian. We had a similar case in the previous chapter in the game between Van Forest and Lecco. And actually, white used the same idea here that they used in that example, because if you remember, Van Forest brought his knight to the attack. He played something like knight f1, that later on he brought the knight to g3 after moving the bishop to f4. And here Pragananda performs exactly the same idea. We can see that there is a big weakness in black's camp. There is a square which black cannot cover with any pawn, and also it's close to their king, and there are no fellow pieces which can easily control that square. Of course, we're talking about the f5 square. This is the square where we would like to bring our knight. So our next move is not very difficult to figure out. Pragananda played here knight f1, getting ready to bring the knight to f5. At this point, black could try to prevent this plan. They could try to play here knight c4. Unfortunately, in this case, white could just kick away the knight, right? Aha, you got it. We can play here rook b4. Nice move in order to kick away the knight, and on the next turn, we would be able to play knight e3. So in the game, after knight f1, Gagare with the black pieces instead played here queen c4. I think that this was based on a miscalculation, because white, of course, they don't want to trade queens. Maybe black thought that by offering the trade of queens and at the same time attacking this pawn on d4, they would actually force white to trade queens. But Pragananda noticed something here, some clever usage of tactics, you could say. He played queen d2, keeping the queens on. The queen gets ready to attack on the king side, but at the same time, he had prepared something here. If black takes the pawn, e takes d4, we will take back. As you can see now, the knight is getting attacked, and no matter how black reacts here, it's difficult for them to make this counterattack work, because if you try, for example, knight b3, that's the move that I was looking at. Somehow we're getting ready to take the pawn on d4, but what do you think white would play? Aha, that's right. Queen a2, that's a very nasty pin, unfortunately. Black can take, theoretically speaking, in three different ways on d4, but none will work because they have this pin to worry about, and also the knight obviously is in the air. So this would not work out for black. For example, bishop takes d4, queen takes b3. So after queen d2, clever move by Pragananda, black actually, they didn't take on d4. Yeah, again, we can look at this, of course, e takes d4, c takes d4. If they take with the bishop, they will run into a different tactic here. Exactly, we can use this nice skewer along the fourth rank. You can see that the bishop is now doomed. If black tries some trick like bishop c3, aha, we can take on c4, and after bishop takes d2, perhaps the simplest choice here. First, intermediate check, rook takes c7, and next turn we will pick up the bishop on d2. So important to see these tactical nuances in the initial position before we opt for this move knight f1. It was good to check these variations with pawn takes d4 and queen c4, or in the other way. Queen c4 first, as in the game. So queen c4 was played in the game, queen d2, no thanks, we don't want to trade queens. And black noticed that the capture wouldn't work tactically. They had to go back with the queen, which is obviously not the ideal way of playing, but okay, it didn't work out tactically. White continued with their plan, knight e3, knight is coming to f5, black played here queen g6, trying to give the king some more cover and try to prevent white's queen from reaching h6. White gave check on f5, and after king h8, Pragananda had already concluded his little maneuver, knight maneuver to f5. Now it's time to see how we can improve our attack in some way. And we're actually back in the previous chapter here, because we should consider how to open up some line for our attack. It's fairly closed, the king side right now. And that's what white accomplished with their next move here. F4, very good move in order to break something here in the position. The F file, the dark squares. Black can take, of course, en passant, but in that case, as you can see, after G takes F3, G takes F3, white will also have the G file to work on. So this would also be troublesome for black. In the game, Gagare took on D4 instead, perhaps in order to keep things closed on the king side. You can see that now the pawn structure is fairly blocked, but still you will see that Praggnanandhaa has enough space in order to continue the attack. C takes d4 was played in the game. I think also we could have considered knight takes d4. Difficult choice when you have two options. The idea of this would be to later on play f5 and knight e6. Maybe Praggnanandhaa didn't want to let black take his proud knight. Perhaps he wanted to keep the knight on the golden square on f5. That's perhaps why he took with the pawn instead. All right, and you can also see, by the way, knight e7. I wanted also to highlight that fact that this move can sometimes be, it can be an interesting maneuver for white to take into account. Black played in the game knight c4, queen c3, and at this point black played d5. Looks like a tactical mistake, but I think that black was rather thinking in terms of a positional sacrifice or a defensive sacrifice. Why do I think that? Well, after knight e7 you can see that white wins material, but black was relying on the following idea. Let's see here, queen h7 after knight takes d5. This is how the game went. Rook takes d5, e takes d5. What black was saying that I can play here knight d6 and bring the knight to the very nice square on f5. So I think actually this was their best chance. That's like, you could say, modern chess. We give up something, we try to get something in return. In this case, black is hoping to block the king side. Unfortunately, we have a big board, right, in chess, and we should be ready to look at the whole board. So what do you think Praggnanandhaa played at this point? How could you somehow tie up black here? How can we restrict black's pieces? That's right, that's a very clever move, rook a1, because in this way actually we restrict two black pieces in one single strike. They can't move any of these two pieces. If knight f5, yeah, I was looking at this also. Interesting move would be here the move d6, so that we can later on also play d5 and open up the long diagonal for the queen. So after rook a1, black played instead queen g8, trying to protect the rook on a8 so that the bishop can move, but here white found a nice move, queen c2. So what do you think? What's the point of this move? Aha, exactly. If they move the bishop, we will take on a8, and later on when they take back, our queen can finally reach, you could say, another weak spot in black's camp, the square on g6. Maybe we could say that, generalizing a little, when you push your pawns, like black did in this game, you have the pawns on g4 and h5 and so on, you should be careful about those squares behind the pawns. Every time, I remember Ulf Andersson talked about that, every time you move a pawn, you create some kind of weakness. And maybe that's the price that black is paying here for that situation of pushing the pawns a little too much. So in the game, they took the pawn on d5 instead, and now Praggnanandhaa just entered with the queen g6, as you can see. That's a decisive invasion in black's camp. Black tried here knight f5, giving up a pawn in order to stir up the game, but Praggnanandhaa wasn't even interested in taking this pawn. He first played here very calmly the move king h2. Very practical approach. I think it was okay also to take the pawn. If you take the pawn, after queen g6, knight f5, if you take the pawn on h5 here, king g7, queen takes d4, I guess somehow he didn't like the idea that black would go back and they would try to bring in the rook to g8. Probably a computer would tell you that white is completely winning, but we are humans and we should try to make it as simple as possible. This was also move 42 in the game, so time travel might have been an issue here. King h2 is much simpler. If they take on g3, I think actually we don't need to take back. Aha, we can actually go for an attack in that case. Rook e7 looks very clever, so that we are threatening to give mate next turn on several squares. So after king h2, black played queen d7, they went back with the queen. And at this point, white noticed that there is an overloaded piece in black's camp. So which piece do you think I'm referring to and how to exploit that? Aha, you got it. The rook is still, you could say, it's pinned to the bishop, or the opposite, the bishop is pinned to the rook. The rook is the bishop is depending on the rook, so we can exploit the situation by taking on a7, because the rook was also covering the 8th rank after rook takes a7. Rook e8, white wins a lot of material, so black resigned here after rook takes a7. Simple, but I think an interesting example. You can also see that black put up a lot of resistance, and Praggnanandhaa had to find his way here. combining threats on the queen side and on the king side. It was not like a knockout win. He really had to put a lot of effort in it. Anyway, for us, the most important part here, I would say, is the initial part. We should notice that we can quickly bring the knight to f5, backed up by some tactical considerations that we can actually give up this pawn after knight f1. Queen c4, we can calmly play queen d2, relying on some different tactics here, like rook b4 if black takes twice, on d4. And at the same time, later on, at a later stage of this example, it was important to see this plan of f4 after queen f7, knight e3, queen g6, knight f5 check, king h8. It was already time to do something more in our attack, to open up some further line for our pieces, and that could be accomplished by f4. I think also, by the way, you can also play f3. This is also possible. Sorry, it would be the same idea. We're trying to open up either the f file or the g file for our attack, while black's pieces are basically on the wrong side of the board, you could say. So simple but nice example by Praggnanandhaa, bring the knight to the golden square on f5. All right, let's check a somewhat more complex example in our next example here. Akobian with white pieces and Hessler playing black. You can see that it's probably black who is attacking. Very often when you have this kind of pawn structure with a pawn on e4, this kind of structure, you can find it, for example, with reversed colors in the Sicilian Alapin and in the Queen's Gambit Accepted. When you have this kind of pawn, it usually means that you have good attacking chances, because by definition you have managed to kick away a knight from f3, I mean a white knight from f3, and you also have some kind of light square control. So that's what black is considering here, how to build up an attack on the king side. You can see that white, they don't have right now so many defending pieces in their camp. Basically only the pawns are shielding the king at this point. And when we talk about attacking weak spots, exploiting weak spots, it's important to understand that we can sometimes toggle between different concrete weak spots, like a pawn on g2, we can sometimes focus on the pawn on h2 and so on, depending on where the opponent's pieces go, so to speak. So that's important to take into account here. All right, let's have a look at what happened in the game. In the game, they played knight d3. This was, you could say, a strategical move. Black is not playing for an attack. They simply want to bring in the knight, but after to improve the knight. But after rook b1, black played here rook a8, playing on the queen side, and white found a nice maneuver here. We will see more of this kind of maneuver in the next chapter about mobilization. What do you think white played here in order to secure their king side once and for all? That's right, they played here bishop e7. Very nice move. You can only play this kind of move if you understand defensive play. Akobian knew that if the bishop could reach the square on g3, this would basically mean the end to black's attacking ambition. So that's what happened in the game. He later brought the bishop to g3, and he went on to win this game, even if perhaps this position is, I would say, rather level. But just wait until we compare this to what could have happened in the game if black had gone for an attack. So how can we go for an attack? I think black's first move, the main difficulty, the reason why Hessler didn't play it, it's because it drops a whole rook. So we're actually talking about our second topic here, sacrifices in the attack. You got it, queen g6, that's the move that we would like to play, and we can actually back it up by concrete calculation. Queen g6, we're trying to mate them at this point basically on g2. That's the weak spot that we're focusing on right now. So let's check the variations here. Of course, first thing to look at here is queen takes a2. And I wanted to ask you, how would you conduct the attack from this point? You can see that there are some light squares that we would like to exploit. Which black piece should go to which square here? What do you think? Aha, that's right. Our bishop should go to f3 because both bishop moves would force white to play g3, but it's better to go this way so that white cannot hide the king on g1, right? Something like that. And also perhaps that's even more important, by the way. Yeah, you could also play the other way around, but the main point is that you don't want them to play f4. Exactly. Defensive thinking. Now, if you go with the bishop to h3, they could probably play something like f4, and you can see that the queen is getting to the attack. So that's probably the main difference here. Yeah, I was thinking about something else. Aha, bishop f3, that's the right way to go here. You can see that if white takes with a knight, we will of course take with a pawn. Threat of mating 1, they have to play g3. It's right, we should bring the queen closer in this kind of situation. Sometimes you would think that this is the best move, but I would recommend to go that way instead, so that we can come to h3 more quickly. They cannot block us, so to speak. This is a basic mate after king h1, queen h3. Rook g1, white manages to prevent the mate on g2, but of course, we will go for the other mate now. So actually here you can already see this kind of thinking. We're focusing on one weak spot on g2, and now we're actually shifting our focus to h2. Now we're going to give mate here. By the way, there is another mating pattern that I'm convinced that you know about. Sometimes you can bring in a rook like this to play rook h6, and there are even some sacrificial patterns with queen takes h2 and rook h6. Of course, here we won't do that because we also have the back rank issue to think about. Also, our king has to be taken into account, and we have the very simple move knight g4. So yeah, that's very simple, of course. So this is what would happen in the event of queen takes a2. White cannot really take there because we have this very strong move, bishop f3. And I think there is not a big difference here, right? Yeah, if you go g3, we can go queen g4 anyway. So as far as I can see, there is no way they can really escape the mate here, even if we're a rook down. They have some feeble threat like queen a4 attacking the rook on e8, but we should just look for a good square for the rook. I think you could even consider something like this. It looks strange to put the rook there, but in this case, actually, if they take, it slows down their own counterattack at our king. So yeah, safe to say, here black is mating white, bishop takes f8, queen h3, and you can see that mate is coming up next. So in the event of the move queen g6, white will have to do something about this threat of bishop takes f3. You got it, they will have to play here instead king h1. By the way, maybe we should talk very briefly also about other options here in this position, because evidently it's also tempting to start an attack straight away, you could say, giving check on f3. So I looked at this also, and the main conclusion here is that white will very often rely on this idea, king h1 and rook g1. So here we would take on f3, and if bishop h3, white would hurry to play here king h1. Definitely they don't care about losing the exchange. They're already piece up and they have to save the skin of their king. The main point here is that they are ready to meet, for example, queen g6 with rook g1, and in the same way, of course, if black takes on f1, we take back, and at some point we will try to play rook g1. So that's one reason why it's actually better to start with the move queen g6. You could say in a way it's more flexible. We don't burn the bridges so early, so to speak. We keep this move in the pocket without being a sacrifice. So anyway, let's see here. White would play king h1. In this way, they would avoid the mating pattern on g2. And now the interesting thing is that since we already know about their ideas, since we know that bishop f3 could be countered by pawn takes and sending the rook to g1, we can now focus on the other weak spot here. We can start focusing on h2. So how do you think we could do that? Which would be black's best move here? The queen alone. The queen alone, of course, cannot do anything about that pawn. It needs support from another piece. And that piece, by definition here, or by elimination, it has to be the rook, probably. And which is the rook which is closest? You got it, the hanging rook on a2. So we can play here the move rook a6. And by now it's crystal clear what black is up to. Of course, queen h5 and rook h6 hitting the pawn on h2. Whenever white plays h3, we will of course consider to take that pawn. Not easy for white to defend the king in some way. As you remember in the game, we saw that also Akobian used this nice bishop maneuver, bringing the bishop to g3. If the bishop was there, of course, it would be a completely different picture, but here they are sort of defenders. So, for example, they could try something like c5. Why do you think they play c5, and what should we do about that? That's right, they're using this idea of obstruction. They would like us to play queen h5, and then they will play c6, give up a pawn in order to trade that rook, or at least avoid its arrival at h6. So we shouldn't play like that. This is what I call prophylaxis in the attack, when you see through the opponent's counterattacks or counter threats and so on, and you take corresponding measures. So since we know that they would like to play c6 and cut off our rook, we should first put the rook on the other side of the pawn, so to speak. Which square might that be? Of course, to f6. Only point of this move is to be able to play queen h5 next turn. So if they go c6, all right, now we can just take it because we have the rook on the other side, and we are ready to play here queen h5 and rook h6. So Let's try something else for white. Queen d5 perhaps, trying to take this pawn and get the queen a little closer. We could just continue with our plan here, queen h5. And after queen takes e4, we go rook h6. Unfortunately for white, if they play queen f4, I think they run into a fork here, right? Exactly, knight e3. We're probably going to take the bishop in the first place, so we're getting back some material. Okay, we're actually only one pawn down, so yeah, not much. We're winning here on the spot, so they will have to play something else after the move. Rook h6, if they go h3, of course, you know the answer here, definitely. We will take that pawn. That's the way tactics work in the attack, so to speak. When we have more pieces in the attack, we're happy to give up something to speed up our attack. So white can definitely not take. After d takes, queen takes, they get mated on h2, and if they play king g1, we should just look for a good square for the bishop. So where would you put this bishop? Which would be the most promising destiny? Aha, of course, we should play here bishop f5, so that we are threatening the queen at the same time as we are threatening mate. So this is important because actually, if you play some other move, white might try to play f3. Sorry, they would then be able to bring the king to f2. If you play something like bishop g4, they would play f3 and they would have some hope still, perhaps. Well, not so much maybe, but in any case, relatively speaking, this is much faster because we pick up the queen here thanks to the mating threat. So interesting example. I have used it many times in training. It's about how we can focus on different weak spots at different moments. Here we start by focusing on the g2 pawn by playing here queen g6. We don't burn the bridges yet. We don't sack our bishop. Still, we wait for white's reply. If they take on a2, yeah, we will play this move. It's not a sacrifice anymore. It's just a part of black's plan of giving mate on g2 or possibly on h2 if white goes king h1 and rook g1 as we saw previously. On the other hand, if white says no, I don't want to allow that, I'll play king h1. Interestingly, what we will do, we will now forget about the g2 pawn and we will focus on h2 instead. We will play here queen h5, I was going to say, but that's wrong, of course. Then I hang the rook. So we should start, you're right, with rook a6. And after that, we're ready for this plan, queen h5 and rook h6. So interesting example. Let's have a look at one more case on this topic of exploiting weak spots in the opponent's camp. Our next example, it's with a more crowded board. Here we have the white pieces Sadorra and playing black is Arjun. You can see that white's pieces are very well placed. They have a lot of pieces in the attack already, but black is fairly solid. Please notice that if you move away the queens, if you remove the queens from the board, actually black will have a good position here because white's pawn structure is a bit weak. The pawn on d5 is weak. But of course, we are here thinking about an attack. Please notice this very nice bishop on b2. It's not every day you can put it here. I think it comes from the Benko Gambit, some line in the Benko Gambit where white didn't hang on to the pawn and they managed to quickly fianchetto that bishop. So safe to say, this will be difficult for black, but white needs to play the cards in the right way. And important to notice here that they will actually focus on all these three weak spots at some moment here in their attack. f7, g7 and h7, these are the typical weak spots, you could say, when you're conducting an attack. So what do you think white played here? Which would be the most powerful move? Which is the piece that you would like to bring to the attack here? That's completely correct. The only piece which is not really participating well, apart from this rook, but actually we will also be able to bring this rook into attack. Just wait. The other piece which is not really helping the attack here is the knight on c3. It's even obstructing the bishop, which means that white's next move could be knight ce4. So that's what the grandmaster played here, knight ce4. He actually doesn't care about the pawn falling on d5. Interestingly, sometimes when we talk about attacking play, we are benefited from losing some material because, yeah, like in gambit play, right? If black takes on d5, as they did in the game, we get this angle also for our bishop. So it's actually helpful for us. Sometimes our pawns disappear, like Paul Murphy would sacrifice the b pawn in the Evans gambit, and then he will use that b file for attacking purposes and so on. The same kind of logic. So very strong move here. Knight c4, we bring the pieces to the attack. And already you can see some concrete threats here, right? For example, knight takes f6, bishop takes, and bishop takes h7. It's not the maximum white can get, but it would be a free pawn, so that also explains black's reply here, knight b takes d5. I wanted to check very briefly some other options for black, because they will show us other ideas within our attacking play in this game. So If they take on e4, knight takes e4, we could take with the bishop. Now we're hitting the pawn on h7. If they go here g6, it's interesting that now we can't really focus on this weakness anymore. But suddenly the dark squares, they got very weak. And of course, we can play here the move queen c3. The move itself won't bring about mate because black can simply play f6, but this means a weakening. In a way, you could say this is like a provocation measure. They didn't want to play f6. They would have preferred to play something like bishop f6, but they don't have time for that. So after queen c3, f6, what do you think white would play? How could white exploit this shaky pawn structure? Exactly. We can now push this pawn, h-pawn, play h5 and soften up white's black's light squares. Like if they go g5, we can later on perhaps bring the knight to f5, or perhaps go back with the queen and target the pawn on h7. So that's important to understand. After knight takes, bishop takes, g6, queen c3, very clever move because it will force black into a move that they don't like to play here. On the other hand, after knight c4, if black plays the move g6 in order to like get to this variation but in an improved version, if knight takes, bishop takes, you will see that they will very much like this because they could bring the queen to f6, and obviously if white takes on e8, they are ready to take back with the bishop. But in this case, it's interesting that white can actually go for a different idea. Now we're back in the previous chapter, how to clear lines for the attack. So if they play g6, they actually provide us with a hook for our attack. So what do you think white would play? Which is that hook I'm talking about? Exactly. We would play here f4. Beautiful position because look at white's pieces. All of them are now in the attack. And we are ready to go f5 next turn. You don't need to really calculate like Mikhail Tal to understand that this must be a very difficult position for black, because simply black is being outnumbered on the king side in this case. You can't compare, for example, this rook with that rook. It's not comparable, no. White's rook is at least 5 points and black's rook, I don't know, 3 points maybe. So difficult for black. Let's have a look at what happened in the game. They played here knight ce4. Black took the pawn on d5, not so much for the pawn, but in order to bring the knight to the defense and be ready to take back on f6. White didn't hurry to take on the pawn on h7, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6. This would be very materialistic to play in this way. Bishop takes h7, king, I guess king f8. Black will be probably okay in this position. We don't have so much attacking potential anymore. So this is of course not the maximum that white can get in this case. What they played here in the game after knight b takes d5 was a much nicer move. They played here knight g5. So now it's already starting to get a little hot on black's king side. If black plays h6, white can actually strike here. White can strike in which way would you think? We are looking at moves like bishop h7, but maybe then they can go king f8. There is another way here to play. We can focus on the weak spot on f7. Sacrifice comes to our way. Exactly. Knight takes f7, very pretty. King takes f7, as you can see. Sorry, we're not in the hurry to take the rook. We have something else going on here. I would love to see Mikhail Tal play this position. He would understand this perfectly. Of course, bishop c4, we put up more pressure here. You can see now there is the threat of bishop takes, and then bishop takes. Black would try to unpin here with king f8, and what do you think white would play? Which is the weak spot that we can exploit? Exactly, we can play now the move queen g6. Again, new threats here, 2 threats at least I would say. We could take on f6, and after they take back, we take on f6, they take back, and we mate them on f7, right? That's one threat, and we could actually also do it the other way around. We could play bishop takes d5, and when they take back on d5, as you can see, they're mated this time on g7. So we are toggling between 2 different weak spots in their camp, you could say. Very difficult for black to defend here. Bishop c6 would be one try. As you can see, now we're ready to take like that. But what do you think white would play? That's right, one more friend to the party, knight f5, and it's game over. They cannot defend against g7, the mate on g7. Please notice how material considerations are irrelevant here. It's just about piece activity. Black, yeah, white could even probably, these 2 rooks could, the wind could take them, and we would still be winning here because black could not defend properly because white has so much activity. So, yeah. That's what could have happened here in this game if black played h6 in the game. They played g6. This is a better try. And white simply continued with the same idea that we already know about. They played here bishop c4, installing the threat of, I think, bishop takes f6. And yeah, if they take back with the knight, we can take on f7. With the knight, probably. It's more powerful than to take with the bishop, I would say. It keeps more threats, so... Black played bishop c6. Black here is defending Arjun, defending very well. trying to keep everything protected. And here again, I might be boring you with this topic, but again, we have to focus on the weak spot here. So surprisingly enough, the weak spot, it's not f7, it's not g7, it's actually not h6, h7 either. I just said it, it's h6. So who do you think would like to reach this square? Aha, we have a very good move here, queen d2. Of course, this move, queen d2, it's not only about bringing the queen to h6. This move also means that we are renewing the pressure at d5 in the sense that we would again like to take on f6, and if they take back, we could take on d5, and they have tactical difficulties. And there should also be other ideas here. Yeah, Mikhail Tal would say knight takes f7, king takes f7, and bishop takes f6 perhaps, and then bishop takes d5, something like that. So many things for black to look after here, and unfortunately they don't have many useful moves. In the game they tried here rook f8 so that the pawn would be protected, and here since white's plan is to bring the queen to h6, what do you think they played? Aha, it's time to go back. Mission accomplished by this knight on g5. It's now coming back to e4 so that we can play queen h6. This is a very nice place for the queen. It would support the attack with at least two mating ideas. One would be to mate on g7 and the other one would be to somehow mate on h7. Yeah, that's basically it. Black tried here knight at b6. The computer is screaming here that we should play knight f5, a pretty move. It requires some calculation. You can see that if g takes, we have queen g5, and later on we can take on f6 with credits to this strong bishop on d2. On the other hand, if knight f5, if black takes on e4, I think this cannot be played, right? This is mate in 1. Yeah, this is not possible. So black would have to take with a bishop, I think. And I think this was the main difficulty why white didn't play this, because they were not sure about these complications. They were not sitting with Stockfish next to them, right? So rook takes e4, that's the point here again. We have this mating idea. And if they play g takes f5, we still break through here, right? Exactly. We will give check, and we will take on e7. And in that case, in the end, the knight will fall off. Aha, exactly. Queen g5 and rook takes e7. And after queen takes e7, we have bishop takes f6. Yeah, pretty picture. So in the game, white didn't play like this, but they had another much simpler choice here. Queen h6, that's what I would play also. We keep all the options open here. And yeah, there are concrete threats already. Knight g5 followed by bishop takes f6. That would be the immediate threat here. So difficult for black to survive in this position. Black played in the game knight takes c4, and white didn't even bother to take back on c4. They actually continued the attack. So let's see if we can figure out how did they do that. In the first place here, as you can see, the queen is actually pinning the pawn along the 6th rank. So we can play this funny move, knight f5. Aha. What's the point of this move? Yeah, if they take, we take on f6 and it's game over. Knight f6 check, bishop takes, and as you can see, mate coming up apart from attacking the queen. So after knight f5, in the game, black played instead knight e8, trying to defend against the mate on g7. It's interesting to notice that if white's queen, if you could take your own pieces, so to speak, white would very happily take their own queen at this point. So this is a motive which we call, I think, clearance. You clear a square for another piece. White can toy a little with this idea in order to find the best solution here. Aha, you got it. That's a very pretty attack. Knight g5. Beautiful. So many hanging pieces, no? But somehow this works in white's favor because they have multiple mating motives. So in the first place here, as you can see, mate in 1 is threatened. And if black takes on g5, what do you think white had prepared? Aha, definitely they could win the beauty prize with this game. Rook takes e8. You can see what I'm talking about here. Complete festival of sacrifices. If bishop takes h6, of course, it's mate on h6. And the other captures are not good either because white is about to give mate on g7. In the very end, if you try to prevent that mate, yeah, you can't prevent it, no? But just in case we couldn't give mate in those ways, we also have an additional mate, queen takes f8. So safe to say it's game over here. Actually, after knight e5, black had already resigned. So fantastic attacking game by Zadora. You can really learn from this game how he used all his pieces in the attack, didn't shy away from sacrifices. And what I think is the main takeaway here is that he was able to toggle between different attacking targets in this case. So knight c4, very good move, but please notice how he later on played a little on the dark squares, a little on the light squares. After knight b takes d5, he was not interested in taking the pawn on h7, which he could have captured by means of double capture on f6. He played instead knight g5, softening up black's kingside. If h6, he was ready to take on f7 to use this plan of bishop c4 and queen g6, focusing on the f7 square. But on the other hand, if g6, then he will actually start focusing on the long diagonal instead by playing here bishop c4. Yeah, actually he's focusing a little on everything here, you could say, because also the f7 pawn is in danger, right? And then queen d2, knight e4, and queen h6. Yeah, just beautiful example. Let's check our next example. Now we will switch topic. Now we will speak a little about sacrifices in the attack, how we can boost our attack by means of sacrifices. I would say this is very natural, because when we are attacking, very often the relative value of the pieces has changed. Some defensive pieces are extremely valuable for the opponent, especially knights. You can imagine some knight on f8 or knight, yeah, like this knight, for example, a knight on f6. So those pieces are prone to sacrifice, because very often the side which is attacking, they have more pieces in the attack. They don't have more pieces on the board, but they have more pieces on that place of the board, because that's the very reason why they started an attack in the first place, right? They saw the motivation for the attack. So it comes natural to sacrifice when you're attacking, because simply some pieces are worth more. Like this knight is more valuable for black than, let's say, the rook on a8, to make one example here. So let's have a look at our next example again. We will see Praggnanandhaa in action. He's a fantastic attacking player. In this game, he has played some kind of Queen's Gambit, playing black is Cornet. Cornet just played here knight g4 with the black pieces, and let's see if we understand this move, knight g4. Aha, probably when he played knight g4, he was concerned about the move h5. So by playing knight g4, he got ready to take on g5 with the queen if white played h5. At the same time, you can see that if white now protects this pawn on f2, which is being attacked, if you play something like rook df1, perhaps what black will do here, since h5 apparently is still not a threat, they would go for their own attack. We have opposed castled kings, so opposite castle king, so it makes sense to start an attack. Something like c5, try to play d4, open up the game for black as soon as possible before white gets a chance to attack. So that's basically, I think, what the French Grandmaster had considered here, knight g4, counterattack at f2, and at the same time preventing h5, since they would have queen takes g5 in the pocket. But since this is the chapter about, or this is the section about sacrifices, what do you think Praggnanandhaa played? Aha, you don't need to ask him twice. He played the right move here. He knows that he already has several pieces in the attack, and he hurried to play here the very nice move, knight takes h7. So what's going on here is basically that we give away that knight, but we manage to damage or ruin black's pawn structure on the king side, the pawns which are protecting the king. And at the same time, when black takes this knight, they will lose time, because we will then continue the attack and they will have to go back with the king at some point. So we win time also for the attack. So two things you could say: we destroy their pawn shelter and we win time for our attack. Of course, they're not forced to take, but then we could just continue anyway with our attack. You can even see that there is something like bishop takes g6 here in the pocket for white. Anyway, black took on h7. That's always an interesting decision. Take or not take what's being sacrificed. We have a chapter about that. I call it dealing with sacrifices. It will come a little later in this course. And already here, this situation was actually very interesting. I always say that the first instinct should be to take what's being sacrificed, accept the sacrifice. But then if we notice that it's not completely convincing, we should have a look at declining the sacrifice. So actually knight takes f2 was very interesting here. So I have a question for you here. What do you think? What is black's next move here? What would black like to play next turn if they were to move again? I think so. Actually, they could take three different pieces with a knight, but I think what they would like to take here in the first place is the bishop, because this is the most important attacking piece within white's camp. So this was actually something that they could have considered. So I had a look at this with a little help from the chess engine. h5, white will just continue the attack. We're not looking back here. Queen g6, that's a difficult move to see, but what black is simply going to do here, they're going to take back on g6 if white takes. They would like to take on d3, and then they would like to take on g6 in order to minimize the danger here. So Probably more promising for white to go back with the knight to g5, and again black will have to make a choice here whether to take here or take the rooks. But I think that what they should do, they should take the bishop at some point. They can play another, you could say, defending move, trying to bring the knight to the defense. And obviously when white takes on g6, that would be the moment to take on d3. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, queen takes c6. Something like this. It seems to me that this would have been sorry, a better path for black, trying to trade off that very important bishop on d3. We call this defensive exchanges. There is a chapter about that also later on in the course. So this bishop is extremely important, and I think black could have considered this path instead, because that was really an important bishop. If we go back to the initial position here, so white played knight takes h7. I think actually this was the best choice. Not so much to take material, but in order to be able to eliminate this bishop. But not so easy to see this sequence. No, h5, queen d6 is definitely not a move that comes natural to us. You can see there are some tactical implications. Also knight b5, I guess we would take and play queen c6, something like that. Tricky to see all this at the board. So it's understandable that in the game after knight takes h7, Cornet simply took back on h7. All right, I don't need to ask you twice for white's next move here, of course. Aha, h5, let's get going with attack. One nice feature of this sacrifice is that black would always love to play g5 to keep the position closed, but we can't do that with the pawn being pinned right now. Sorry, so king g8 was played in the game, and white hurries to open up the game here. H takes g6, you can see that ultimately that queen and bishop would love to enter on the light squares in this position. Black played f6 here to keep things closed, and Praggnanandhaa simply played here rook df1. The computer had some other idea here about sacrificing more material, but I think this is very practical because white knows that the attack is like long term. This is something important to understand. It's not like we're winning on the spot, but we have something going on the king side of black. They don't have many pieces there. One nice idea that you can consider is something like bringing the knight to the attack also. Another idea might be to invade with the rook and so on. And I think in material terms, we have already 2 pawns also for the piece. So I think it's not like the attack is running away or something. So it was a good choice by him. Very practical choice. Very practical. Just protect the pawn and then get going with the attack. Black played in this game knight c6 to develop quickly, and Praggnanandhaa plays his idea here with knight e2. I think there was the computer who was saying also that we could play bishop e2 hitting the knight, and after knight h6 we could play something like knight takes d5, I think. This was also in the pocket. No, probably not. Knight h5 and knight h6, and you could play rook h5, hitting the pawn here or something like that. Even I think, yeah, this would be the best way to go. If they play, in my notes I have queen d7, and then you would play this move rook h5, targeting the pawn here and bringing the rook there. But I think I like his approach more, because you can see black has an important defender here. This bishop on g7 is really defending the house here. So what he does is very logical. He would like to trade off that bishop at some point, which will mean that the rook can join and cause more damage. So I like this move, definitely. Knight e2, you could say mobilization to the attack. What we looked at in the previous chapter. Black played here queen d6, bringing the pieces to the defense. After knight g3, they played knight e7, so that knight f5 is prevented. But now white shifts focus a little. They want to put a knight on h5, but first let's bring in the rook, so that once we play knight h5, we are actually hitting the bishop on g7. So very, very difficult to play this with black. They tried in the game f5, giving up some material to clear space for the queen. White played knight h5, ignoring the offer. Black has to protect the bishop or move it. They played bishop f8, and here white simply took on f5, which means that probably the queen can also join the attack. And we have so many different ideas here. Some move like g7 coming up, rook h8, things like that. Very, very hard for black to defend. Please notice again, we're always back on this topic. If you compare attacking and defending forces, you can easily see that these two pieces are not really working in the defense. So black is basically being outnumbered here. They tried knight f6. Now a lot of pieces are hanging and attacking each other. Praggnanandhaa looked at the whole board, and he noticed a nice piece of deflection, because you can see that from all the things going on here, one crucial thing is that the queen is defending the knights. If white could take it, it's mate in one. So how do you think we could deflect black's queen? Which piece could help us? Aha, it's a piece which hasn't done too much in this game, but now its moment has come. Bishop b4, we're deflecting black's queen from the defense of the knight. They played in the game c5 and we just take back. As you can see, nothing's going on here really for black. B takes e5, bishop takes e5, and black called it a day. They're unable to defend here in some good way. I don't know, could they play queen e5? Would this help? I don't think so, since they resigned in the game. They must have had a good reason. Yeah, I can think of different moves here. Perhaps the simplest one would just be to play bishop d4, so that we attack the knight again. And yeah, they can take here, and we're happy to take back. And as you can see, queen takes, knight takes f6. Maybe not the only way, but yeah, certainly that would be one way to continue. So here, after bishop c5, black resigned at this point in the game. Very nice effort by Pragananda. Knight takes h7, important, typical, you could say, typical transaction in this sense of sacrifices in the attack to give up a piece. Knight takes h7, like the bishop sacrifice, you know, the Greek gift, bishop takes h7, something similar. It was interesting that after king takes h7, h5, it was very difficult to stop white in their attack. They have so many pieces joining the attack, but it was good to notice after king g8, pawn takes f6, rook df1, knight c6. It was good to notice this move, knight e2. I think that's really, really important, that we can see this move, that we can understand that it's time to bring in more pieces to the attack. Yeah, by the way, there was a tactical pitfall here. I think I was thinking about this also, knight takes d5. Idea queen takes bishop c4, but I guess Cornet had prepared knight takes d4 here, and then take on d5 with the bishop. Something like that. The game will become more complex, so it's good to also not, what would you say, be too confident. No, we need to take into account the opponent's chances also. So very nice move here, knight e2, bringing the knight to the attack in one way or another. Also interesting to observe that after knight takes h7, possibly black's best chance here in this chaotic position would have been knight takes f2, mainly in order to be able to trade off that bishop on d3. So interesting. All right, let's have a look at another example. Here we saw the handover of a piece in order to help our attack. Another typical sacrifice. You can sacrifice a pawn, for example, like in the previous chapter. Rachmanov did this, if you remember that IQP battle where he played d5, opening up the long diagonal for the bishop. And another typical transaction is to give away the exchange. This happens very often simply because a knight can be an excellent defender, and the rook, well, maybe we have two rooks in the attack, we can give away one of them in order to eliminate that important defending knight. So that's what happened in our next example. We have with white pieces Santos Ruiz and playing black Jacobian. You can see that this is a very double-edged position, strategically speaking. White seems to be doing better here because they have a nice blockade on the light squares, you can see. Also, you can see they are about to push their queenside pawns, while black, apparently, they have more difficulties in pushing their central pawns. But also, please notice, there is something going on the king side. It's not evident at this point. White's king side seems to be very safe, but there is a way in which we can actually benefit from the fact that their knight's a little offside. A knight would just have loved to be on d2. That would have been a completely different story, but it's not there. So black took the moment here before white starts a counterattack on the queen side with like b5, or maybe they would stabilize with queen d3. Black found a very nice way to carry out the sacrifice. You would say, aha, it must be about an exchange sacrifice, but we can't really sacrifice the exchange here. If we sacrifice on f3 in some way, white will take back. We can see that the queen is there also protecting the crucial square on f3, but that explains black's next move here. You got it. That's a very nice move. d3, just right on time before white gets b5 in. Now, whenever they play b5, we can consider to put a knight on d4 and so on. So d3, very timely move. What black has noticed here, I was going to say, is that there is now the idea of taking on f3 and take on f3 and bring in the knight, something like that along these lines. Let's see what happens in the game. They played in the game rook e3, very cautious choice, trying to defend a little here and attack a little there. If they accept the sacrifice in the first place, this would be a tactical mistake. As you can see, we have a tactical motive of a skewer or a pin along the d file. Black could simply take on and then bring the rook to the d file, something like that. And as you can see, once white moves the bishop, they will lose the other bishop because we can take on f3 and take on d2 in the very end. So that's not possible after d3. On the other hand, I think that if they play bishop takes d3, they also get destroyed here. Yeah, we can play in different ways, perhaps the same way with rook d8, or we could also carry out the idea that we were talking about, bishop takes, g takes, and knight e4, knight takes f3. You can see that also the queen can come to h3. This would be simply disastrous for white. So very strong move, d3. White played in the game rook e3, trying to attack this pawn and defend the knight. Black took on f3 at this point, which I wanted to say also, this is not something black really wants to do. It would have been a bad move if it was not for the next move that they will play here in the game. So white took back on f3. If they play rook takes d3, I think we have intermediate move knight e4, exactly. But what they played in the game was instead to take on f3 with the bishop, the most natural recapture. We will come to this later. There were two captures, well, three captures, but we can't really count d takes f3, it's so ugly. But we could look at the other two captures. In the game they played bishop takes f3, and this lets black carry out their key move in this game. Before white gets a chance to bring back the bishop to e4, what do you think they played? No, they didn't play knight e4, because in this case white can take on d3, and I think white is still alive in this position, right? They played something much stronger. Aha, you got it. They took on f3. This is very beautiful, because now white loses a crucial defender on the king side, and when they take with the rook, again we won't play knight d4. If we play that, white can then take on d3, I think not with the queen, because then we take and we pick up the bishop as usual, but they can actually take with a rook here. This is something that black must have noticed in the game. You can see that knight takes, this is not what we want, of course. Rook takes e7, we can take on a1, but this is, yeah, definitely not our idea. They will be much better here, take one of these pieces and so on. So after rook takes f3, black didn't play knight e4. They played something else first. Of course, you got it. That's a simple move with many benefits. e4, protecting the pawn, opening up the bishop and kicking away white's rook. That's how the game went. And after rook h3, only now they play their move knight d4. So you can see that in the end, it's not like some kind of temporary sacrifice that black got back the material. No, they are actually the exchange down here. If you count the material, you'll see they're a clear exchange down, but they have such a nice command of the center that they can go for an attack without any big problems. No, somebody said no a long time ago, when you control the center, you're entitled to attack on the flank, something like that. It might not always be completely valid, but I think it's a valid direction of thought, at least not as a rule, but as a direction of thought. So black is firmly controlling the center. These pawns are, of course, worth more than a usual 1 point. They are worth a bit more, which means that they have a very nice attack coming up. You can see that also the pawn on d3 helps black to put a knight on e2. So that's how the game went. So before we continue, still I wanted to go back very briefly to see if we have the complete picture here. So when black started all this whole action, now when they started the whole action here with d3, they had seen this picture, now that they would sack the exchange at the very end. But I wanted to show you that also white could have considered a sacrifice. After bishop takes f3, it seems to me that white should have played rook takes f3, and after rook takes f3, they should actually take with the pawn. I was wrong. This is not a sacrifice, really. But it's like a positional sacrifice in the sense that you're sacrificing your pawn structure. But this would have been more reliable for white. Interestingly, no? They deliberately double their pawns in order to avoid the entrance of the knight. As you can see, we talked about this, right? Knight e4 is very painful for white. Knight takes and the bishop hangs. But white could actually take with the pawn instead. Sometimes we have to resort to this kind of extreme measures, weaken our pawn structure, but this would give us greater flexibility or greater stability, because now the pawn is blocked on e5. So white would be still in some problems here. I think the computer was saying that black is clearly better, something like knight g8 and bring a knight here. But okay, I'm a human, and I think that here, I have seen the game, here white could defend in a better way. Perhaps at some point play king h1 and rook g1 and so on. This would have been perhaps a lesser evil. Now, let's have a look at what happened in the game. So they played bishop takes f3, and black hurried to take on f3 first. And here it's not the same thing. Now d takes f3 is different because we have a very nice move here. What do you think black would play? Hint, it's not knight d4. Aha, we will open up more space for our attack. e4, we're back in the previous chapter here, clearing space for the attack. You can see that the queen is coming this way, or if they take like that, it can come that way also. Queen here, and we're toggling between different weaknesses. Queen f4, targeting the pawn on h2. This would be very dangerous for white. If they protect it, well, they drop the bishop on d2 instead. So rook takes f3. Now finally let's enjoy this game. e4, black's game plays itself here. e4 protecting the pawn, opening up the bishop towards h2. They play here rook h3 and knight e4. Very simple, this part of the game. Queen d1, white tries to play queen h5. We should always keep an eye on our own king. For that reason, knight e2 makes perfect sense to obstruct white a little. King h1. And who do you think should join the party at this point? That's right, time to bring in the rook. Also rook f8. White cannot do the same, unfortunately, for obvious reasons. They played bishop e3. Black played bishop e5, targeting the rook, and after rook a2, now the queen is undefended. You can see every move has a logic. Now, if rook b1, at least for starters, black could consider at some point, maybe not now, but maybe later, knight c3. So white put the rook here. Perhaps white was hoping to take also on e2, possibly give back material, but black found a nice queen move here. Aha, you got it, of course, queen g4, very pretty move, bringing the queen closer to the defense, protecting the knight, and also enabling this cheap tactic, knight g3 check. So queen f1 was played in the game, and I would like you to find black's next move here. Very simple and very beautiful. Aha, there is only one friend left to invite to this party. Yeah, you got it, it's the knight. So they played here knight f5. Beautiful, beautiful position. So many pieces in the attack. And white has some spectators here, you could say, like the rook and the knight. Impossible to defend here in this position, a little similar to the game Sadora Arjun, when white had all the pieces piled up against black's king. Complete nightmare. Let's see how the game finished. Bishop c5, and black had many tactical ideas here. Knight moves to g3 is a good start. That's what they did in the game. Knight fg3, exploiting the pin along the f file. H takes g3, knight takes d3. Rook takes g3, bishop takes g3. Now there is the threat of mate, so white hurried to use the king move here. You remember this from the game Lenderman versus... who was playing black? Jeffrey Chong, maybe? King g1, and at this point, as you can see, black can just continue with the plan here, queen h5. Threat of mate, so white will have to take. You can see that still white is putting up a great defensive effort here. Now, modern players like Santos Ruiz in this case, very good defenders. Now they don't slip in tactics. Now they defend until the very end. Rook takes f1, king takes f1, queen d1, check. This check is the strongest one, since after king f2 we can play here d2. I think it's interesting, it's a telling fact that even in this final position actually white is slightly material up, but of course their position is completely lost because we will give check and queen next turn, right? But still you could say black's strategy paid off here. Very nice attacking sacrifice, this whole sequence now, starting with d3, later on getting ready to take on f3, and to even tactic change on f3, which white perhaps should have avoided, but they didn't do that in the game. We saw this sequence now, d3, rook e3, bishop takes, and here, very nice approach, rook takes f3, and after rook takes e4. Clean exchange, but black's attack soon proved to be unstoppable. All right, we will move into the last part of this chapter, which is about paying attention to the opponent's ideas and trying to meet them in some way when we're attacking. So we have two ways we can look at this. One of them is that we try to prevent their ideas, and the other one is that we will try to take prophylactic measures so that these ideas that they have won't be that successful. So we have the same kind of thinking in general, I would say, in strategical play. I talked about this, I touched upon this topic in Mastering Chess Strategy. Two facets of prophylaxis, you could say. Let them do what they want to do, that's prophylaxis, and prevent their plans, that would be restriction. So this comes back here in attacking situations, is basically the same kind of thinking. We also have provocation, where we force them into some unwanted actions, a move that they would not like to do. For example, weakening their pawn structure in front of the king. All right, enough talking. Let's have a look at our first example in this part of the chapter. It's a simple example. We're playing with the white pieces here. Ioannidis with the white pieces and Ingic playing black. You can see that the opening didn't go very well for black. Already their king is in trouble. I think the last move was here king d7. They're trying some kind of artificial castles to the queen side. Several moves pop up here for us, moves like e6 or f6 or maybe knight e4. It's a pretty move that I think many of us would like to play here, to put the knight on c5 or d6 and f6. Yeah, so many good things we can do here. You can say that there are multiple ways to get an advantage, but I really like the way in which Ioannidis proceeded here. He knew that the king would like to go to b8, and in that case, even if black would have a difficult time, at least their king would be a little safer. So, for example, if you play here knight e4, they would go king c8. You go knight e6, and they go king b8. Of course, white is having a huge positional advantage, and they're not even material down. But we could try to be a little more like maximalists, and we could try to get even more out of this. And that's what happened in the game. Since white knew that the king was going this way, they found a way to prevent, well, we can't prevent king c8. But there is a way in which we can prevent king b8. So which move do you think would make black think twice about king c6? Sorry, king c8. Which move would not make them too happy about putting the king there? You got it. That's what white played here, queen d4. Of course, you can tell me that this move was not played with that intention. The intention of queen d4 was to play e6 and pick up the knight. Well, I think partly also that, but still, if you consider that if now black plays king c8, they will actually protect the knight. But here, of course, white will play queen e7. So I think this is what actually happened in the game. White saw that the queen would be very nasty on a7. You can now already picture ideas such as, for example, knight a4, knight p6 with mate. And even if black would avoid the mate by moving the queen somewhere, you can see that still this would be very troublesome for black, because even if the king moves away, our queen could continue to enter and so on. So very nice thinking here by white, queen d4. They simply know that the king wanted to go to c8, but then we will visit the king here with the queen, queen a7. Black played in the game rook g8, protecting the knight. Now we continue with a typical plan here, knight e4, trying to enter with the knight. Black defends in the best possible way. They played here rook f8, protecting this pawn in advance. I think at this point what Ingic was hoping to do here, he wanted to meet e6 with f takes e6, queen takes c7, and king c8, and create some kind of tactical turmoil. Maybe this is also good for white, but you can see that the pawn is hanging, so not so convincing. White said, all right, I don't have any need to force the game in that way. He continued with the plan here, queen a7. So this is much smarter, because now we're about to check them, and they cannot go this way anymore because they will get mated. Actually, both checks are interesting here. So black played f6. Yeah, this cannot work simply. Many ways for white to continue, tactic change and so on. But again, white went for the most powerful way. They played here knight c5. The king now cannot go down because it gets mated, so they played instead king e8. White took on b7, not so much for the pawn, but in order to enable knight d6. After f takes e5, you can see that we could take the queen, but then they take ours. We don't want that, of course, because we're on the attack. White played a nice sacrifice here. Speaking of sacrifices, well, a temporary sacrifice. Aha, you got it. Since this rook is right now busy pinning the knight, we can play here the move rook takes c6. That's what he played in the game, so that if the rook takes, we can take on d8. As simple as that. Complete demolition here. Rook takes f5 was played in the game, and white simply continued. Many options here, of course, knight checks and things like that. But yeah, let's be practical. Rook fc1 is much nicer because we keep the rook protected. Also, black took on c6, rook takes c6. Now definitely knight d6, apart from knight takes d8 is a big threat here. Rook f7. Black really, they do their best to keep the game confusing, but after white's next move, there won't be any more confusion. What do you think Ioannidis played at this point? That's right. That's a nice move. Rook c8. In this way, we deflect the queen from d8 so that we can go knight d6 next turn. So black resigned here. Yeah, very nice, very effective play by white. I like this first move here, queen d4. There might be multiple choices, but I think this is the most practical way to proceed. Some kind of prophylactic thinking. We know that if they go to c8 with the king, we can then enter with the queen, and they won't be able to bring the king to its supposed destiny on b8. All right, let's have a look at our Next example, it's about, you could say, something similar in the sense that we are looking at opponent's plans. We're trying to understand what the opponent would like to do. And here, in this game between the white pieces Predke and playing black is MVL, Marcel Lagrave, you can see that it's positioned with opposite castled kings. Both sides would like to attack. Black has some hopes of pushing b5 at some point, attacking the pawn on c4 and so on. But the move g5 sticks out a little, because that pawn definitely, it would have been safer on g6 in that case. White's attack would take longer time, but okay, for reasons for the opening itself, it's already on g5. So what happens here is that white considers black's plans, and they can see that one key idea for black is actually to play at some moment g4. For example, if white goes h4, they will then go g4, which means that the position remains closed, which is good for black. They can keep white's attack at bay. So what white do here, since they know this idea of g4, they prevent it. Now we're talking restriction 100% here. We want to basically kill that idea of g4 blocking the position. For that reason, you can imagine what black played here exactly. They play g4 themselves. That's a very nice way of thinking. You can only play such a move if you actually understand what your opponent is up to. So now, after knight takes d4, you can guess white's next move. Now we play h4, because they don't have g4 anymore. Very clever thinking by Predke. Even MVL couldn't save this position. They followed g takes h4, rook takes h4, and f5. In this way, black is protecting the knight and also trying to obstruct white's queen along the b1 h7 diagonal. White's next move is very simple and very strong. We would like to continue the attack. The knight is annoying. It's actually also obstructing white along the g file. So white's next move is very simple here, bishop e2. So we are ready to take on g4 and then take on h7, but at the same time we're also enabling a rook transfer to g1, or to h1. Knight takes f2, rook g1, this would be terrible for black. So many pieces in the attack, and also the knight is possibly going to be trapped here at some point by rook h2. Perhaps if the knight goes back, we can just take it, and we would bring the queen to the attack, or if you go this way, we'll take like that. So difficult for black to defend this position. In the game, after bishop e2, they played knight f6. And here, we're back in the previous chapter about clearing space for our attack, opening lines for the attack. What do you think Predke played? That's correct. We can try to open up this diagonal for the queen. He played here the move e4, very powerful, before black gets the chance to build up some kind of counterplay on the queen side. Predke analyzed here queen c5 was the last chance, so that after e takes f5, e5, and knight f3, b5, this was the last chance at Predke. Well, difficult to see this at the board, but here it seems that somehow white's pawn is blocking their own attack a little, and black can start some attack on the queen side. But in the game, black played a more natural move. They took on e4, and after knight takes e4, they took on d4, because in this way they're hoping that this pawn phalanx will keep white's attack at bay. But you'll see what happens here. White has so many pieces in the attack. They played first rook g1. You can see that going to the corner is very dangerous, because white could then start mating ideas, mating motifs on the g and h file, right? Knight g5, very powerful, with rook takes h7 as a big threat here in this position. I think Predke analyzed bishop e3. Interesting try, interesting try to take the rook in the end. But of course, white can ignore this, and after bishop takes d5, just take back. And as you can see, yeah, the attack is playing itself. We can bring in the queen and so on. Sacrifices perhaps with rook takes h7 might also be possible. So rook g1 check. Black played here king f7, bringing the king to the other side. And here we have a key move. Of course, rook takes h7. We did the first move to check, but white correctly establishes that we can keep that for later. We have another check. We can also keep that for later. Sometimes it's better to keep all the options in the pocket, flexibility in the attack, so to speak. He played here the move c5. So what do you think is the point behind c5? Why did he play that? Good point. We create a square for the knight on d6, but more specifically, we're actually attacking the bishop now in an indirect way, because black's queen is not defending it anymore. So we would try to give check with knight e5 or knight e6, and finally pick up the bishop. Yeah, simple tactical idea. Interception, I think, is what you can call this, when you intercept the queen or obstruct the queen along this diagonal where it's fulfilling a defensive function. So black played here queen b4. There was an interesting variation here. I have used it in training. If black plays queen takes b2 check, trying to simplify into an endgame, queen takes, bishop takes, king takes, pawn takes. In theory, this would work well, but I'm convinced that both players at the board, they knew exactly how this would end. But you can only win this if you apply a proper usage of candidate moves. So which would be the candidates here? Well, this is one, that is another one, and I think there is one more, right? Aha, we also have this move. So that's important because this check is slightly more powerful than the other check, in the sense that we're not only giving check, we're also tying black's king to the rook, right? So if king e7, as you can see, we would pick up a rook here by rook g7, because if king e8, we can go bishop h5. And in the end, black's king is deflected from the defense of the rook. They could also play king e8 first, and then we play bishop h5. So it's just the same thing, but a different move order. So very nice calculation here by Predke in the game. Vachier played queen b4 and simply a3, so that eventually the queen will have to move away from the defense of the bishop. So here black resigned, because if they play something like, yeah, let's say queen a5, you can play knight e6 and you pick up the bishop. You have a free bishop, and also black's king is still in big trouble. You can probably also give the check here. Yeah, it's a matter of choice. I think personally I would give this check because that enables me to take command of the 7th rank later, but okay, that's a minor detail. The important thing here is that we take the bishop. So very nice. You could say prophylactic or restrictive thinking by Predke. He knew that g4 was a key resource in black's play. We should not let them play that. We should start with g4 so that we can go h4 next turn to make sure that the h file is opened. This would be like a positional self-goal, you could say, h4, g4, and it wouldn't be that easy to attack anymore. So very important to see this move first. Okay, we have arrived at our final part of this chapter, where we're talking about different ways of considering the opponent's ideas. We were talking about preventing them or taking prophylactic measures, like Ioannidis' queen maneuver to a7. But in this last part, it's about the opposite. We're actually forcing them into moves that they don't want to play. Provocation, so to speak. And in our first example, it's a rather simple business here. White's playing for an attack. They already have a lot of pieces in the attack. With white Kovalyov and playing black as Kuipers. What Kovalyov noticed here is that he can actually strike immediately. There were several candidate moves here, rook g4, rook h4. It seems that black can put up some defense with g6 in that case, stubbornly defending some chances of counterplay with rook d8 and so on. But what Kovalyov played here was a sacrifice. He played bishop takes h7. After king takes, you would say, how does this work? Because if we go for an attack straight away, queen h5, king g8, and rook g4, rook h4, you can see that black would be able to play f something, no? f6 or f5, I guess f6, and the king could perhaps sneak away. We saw a similar picture, by the way. In which other example did we see that? Yeah, in the example, the one, if you remember, the one Akopian, the game about attacking weak spots, where they played queen g6 and rook a6 and queen h5 and rook h6. In the very end, if you remember, black was mating on the h file, and I was saying that bishop f5 was the most precise move, because if we don't play that, maybe white would play f3 and king f2. Something like that. Well, hopefully you know what I'm talking about. In any case, this would give black chances for defense because the king could sneak away. So what do you think? How could we improve this? We're talking provocation. Can you think of a pawn move that black would not like to play here? That's 100% correct. They don't want to play g6 because then they get mated. How can we bring about g6? You got it. We will attack the pawn on g7. Rook g4 was played in the game. You can see that they cannot protect this pawn because then they get mated in one. Rook g8, queen h5. If they play g6, we have the other mate we were talking about, rook h4 and rook h8. So in the game, they had to play instead f6. But this means, unfortunately, that now the pawn on e6 is also in the air. So Kovalyov gave check, rook h4. And after king g8, yeah, we cannot go up due to the mate on h5. After king g8, he played here queen takes e6. Unfortunate for black, tragedy of one tempo, what you would say. Actually, after rook f7, black's king is safe, but the rook is not safe. The other rook, I mean, queen takes e8. So white wins here. Black had already resigned after rook d4 actually, yeah, this was not a long example. It ends here actually, bishop takes, king takes, and after rook d4, Kuipers actually resigned here because he saw the whole sequence with f6, rook h4, king g8, and queen takes e6. Picking up the queen, rook on c8. Interesting now that we have to look at the whole board here. It was not only about attack, but it was about the fact that this clever move, rook d4, it forces black to make a move that they didn't want to make, either with the pawns or with the rook. And you can also see that we shouldn't always give check, right? That's another aspect of attacking chess. Sometimes those quiet moves can be very powerful. Please remember Pragananda's move rook f1, for example, protecting the pawn on f2 before he continued with his knight maneuver. Here we have the same picture again, rook g4. I wouldn't say it's a quiet move, but it's not a check or a capture, right? And it greatly helps White's attack. Our last example is a little longer, but it's basically about the same thing. We are using our pieces for provocative measures. In this older game between Marjanovic playing white and Adamski with the black pieces, you can see that white, they sacrifice the pawn, but they have some attacking potential on the king side. So Marjanovic starts with provoking a move that black didn't want to play really in this position, but black would like to do perhaps something like rook e8 and bishop f8, safeguarding the king side, but they won't have time for that. Queen g3 was the first move here with the threat of mate in 1. Black cannot put anything on f6, as you can see, because in that case, knight f6 we take, and the queen is hanging. So after queen g3, black played instead here the move g6, so as to secure the pawn and avoid the mate. But this means some weakening of the dark squares. White now played queen h3. We remember this pattern from the Sadora game. We're bringing the queen towards the weakness on h6. Black couldn't really prevent this. They played knight e6 in the game, trying to get rid of White's strong bishop. White simply retreated the bishop so that we keep it for the attack. Please notice there was a tempting way to win material here. Maybe you noticed this little idea of bishop f6, pretty move, but not top priority here. Black would be very happy to take back on f6, and after rook takes, as you can see, this kind of position would be fine for black. Material about equal and no real attack to speak about. This is something that Marjanovic annotated, I think, in the chess informant, this variation. So bishop c3, we keep our attacking pieces on the board. Black played queen c7 so as to unpin the knight. And of course, we continue with attack, and we continue with this provocative spirit, queen h6. Very nice move, because as you can see at this point, black will have to further weaken their king side. They played at this point, I was going to say f6, but they didn't play f6 because in that case this pawn would get extremely weak. We could perhaps attack it with a bishop, or we could attack it also with a queen, unless there is something better. Oh, there is something better. Marjanovic tells me that knight c5 is actually very powerful, threatening mate, and if they take, obviously, we give the other mate. So very nice thinking here, queen h6, we're provoking some kind of weakness on black's camp. They played in the game e5, and this has the defect of opening up the a2 g8 diagonal. So white quickly played here the move bishop c4. Now, as you can see, black's king is starting to feel very uneasy in this position. There are many ideas for white that they can take into consideration, and black can hardly move. In the game they played rook king h8. If they played rook fd8, I was going to say white could immediately use this to their favor by playing bishop takes f7. Typical sacrifice in the Sicilian king takes, queen takes, with a very strong attack. So after bishop c4, black instead played king h8. And white hurried to bring another piece to the attack. Maybe you remember Dubov's nice game about mobilizing the rook to the battle. If you remember rook e1, rook e3, rook g3. Here, Marjanovic did something similar, a very nice rook lift here by means of rook d3. The rook is coming to h3 to attack the pawn on h7. Now black played rook d8. You can see that they're ready to give up a pawn on f7. White first played rook h3, and after knight f8, they defend the pawn, but of course it has a price. Now white can take the pawn on f7. You can see that by now there is a concrete threat, I think, of bishop takes g6, and also things are starting to happen on the long diagonal. So safe to say black's case here is very, very difficult, but Adamski, he puts up a good fight here. He played in the game queen d7. Don't forget about the opponent's threats, please. Don't only look at the opponent's king, look at your own king also. What should white play here? That's right, that's a cheap tactic, queen d1. We have to prevent it. Marjanovic simply played rook e1, bringing the rook to the battle also, and avoiding this little tactical pitfall. So very difficult to defend black here. You can see that the pieces are not overly active in the defense. All white's pieces are involved in the attack. Knight d4 was played in the game, giving up the pawn on e5 after f takes e5. They played here knight f5. As you can see, there must be something with e6 here, but there is something with rook takes e3 also. I think there were multiple ways to win here, but what Marjanovic played was simple enough. He played e6 anyway, since after rook takes c3, e takes d7, knight takes h6, he could simply take back the rook, but with a knight, so that we are also attacking the bishop on e7, and at the same time, as you can see, the knight is also being attacked. So if knight takes f7, unfortunately rook takes e7 is completely lost for black. White's material advantage is decisive here, as you can see. In the game they played instead rook takes e7, and I think the last move is a nice one, the last move in the game. What white played here, yeah, they didn't take on h6 because of king g7, I suppose. And maybe black has some chances here still with a minus exchange. Yeah, probably not so much, but there is a much nicer move for white. Aha, you got it. Intermediate move here, bishop e8, short but clever move, because in this way we actually win the whole rook here in the end. We will take either here or there, well, depending on black's play, obviously. But they can't really keep the material balance here. I don't know, we can try something, knight f5 maybe, but we could maybe take on d7, knight takes. It seems that this bishop is protected by the knight, so we could kick the knight and we would then win the game, I think. Is there any more tactics here? Bishop h4? Well, perhaps we can create another threat here, rook e8 or rook d1. Yeah, matter of choice. Something will fall here, that's for sure. And actually, black had resigned already here after bishop e8. So what you have seen here is simply that white can use the queen. The queen is very good with provocation. We start with queen g3, provoking the move g6, and after that we're ready to provoke a further weakening of black's kingside by queen h3 going to h6, so that black will have to play f6, also ugly move to play, but unfortunately due to the pressure along the d file, black is not able to put something on f6, which they would have liked, or to play something like this. It's also too slow, as you can see in this position, because of the problems along the d file. So for that reason, this strategy, white's provocation strategy, was very successful in this case. After knight c6, bishop c3, and after queen c7, queen h6, very unpleasant for black. There is no good move here really for black. All of them will weaken the king in one way or another. So that was a very nice display by Marjanovic. All right, we have seen quite a bunch of examples here about attacking play, different ideas within attacking play. It's time for our quick recap here. We saw Praggnanandha's example, very simple, bring the knight towards the outpost on f5, you could say. Later on, try to open up the attack with f4, sorry, clearing more space for the attack. We saw that in this game between Akobian and Hessler. Hessler had a very nice possibility here, queen g6, going for an attack, preparing to play bishop f3. The rook, that doesn't matter, and if white plays king h1, then we will bring back the rook. We switch focus. Now we focus on the h2 pawn instead. This will be very difficult for white to handle. We saw Sadora's excellent attacking display, starting with knight e4, later on targeting several weak points in black's camp, using the bishop also for this purpose. It was difficult for black to keep track of all these weaknesses, you could say, at the same time. We saw Praggnanandha in the context of sacrifices, how knight takes h7 turned out to be very powerful, because we win time and we weaken black's king in this way. We saw that in the other example, Santos versus Hakobian. We saw the idea of sacking the exchange on f3, starting with d3 and later on take on f3 twice, and put the pawn on e4 and knight e4. Yeah, I'm telling you the whole game here, but yeah, d3, rook e3, bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes e4. This picture, that's what I'm trying to say. It was very useful because simply white's minor pieces were very important in their defense, and now black got like a greater number of attacking pieces on the king side thanks to this smart sacrifice, which also helped to avoid a blockade on the light squares. We saw in the terms of prophylactic thinking that Ioannidis wanted to put the queen on a7 before Ingrid's king reached b8. This was a very clever way of thinking. We saw that Pretke didn't like the idea of MVL playing g4, so before Continuing with the attack, he first made sure that this resource would not exist within black's play, so for that reason he played here g4 and only then h4. Finally, we saw two examples about provocation in the attack. We saw this very nice example. Kovalyov hurried to play rook g4 after sacrificing whole bishop because he knew that there was no good way for black to defend his pawn. For example, g6 would run into mate and so on. And finally, we saw Marjanovic using the queen in a very clever way to provoke multiple weaknesses on black's kingside. After that, it was difficult for black to save their skin. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.